Okay. Let's see. All right. Hopefully this records properly. So I'm going to go back to chapter 2. I've done chapter 1 and 2, but I read chapter 2 about 2 months ago. So what I want to do now is start about halfway through chapter 2 and just skim through that. And oh, my microphone is connected. And then hopefully get to chapter 3, if possible, if I have the time and the patience. So let's see how far it goes. Okay. The sectarianization of geopolitics after the Arab uprisings. The Arab uprising substantially transformed the behavior of a number of Middle East states and ultimately invited direct external, namely Russian military intervention in the region's geopolitical battles. Both Qatar and Turkey abandoned their former pragmatic stances and jumped onto the uprising's bandwagon to carve out new regional roles for themselves. Qatar used its affiliations with the Muslim Brotherhood to co-opt Islamist parties that assumed power after authoritarian regime breakdown in a bid to bolster its geopolitical weight. The small sheikhdom played a proactive role in regime change in Egypt and Libya, shelved its former differences with Riyadh, and openly endorsed regime change in Syria. Remember, this is Assad days, offering a bevy of Salafi jihadi group military and material aid. It led to an Arab League campaign to ostracize Damascus and expel it from Arab organizations, threatened to apply the full weight of the UN Charter against the regime, successfully engineered Hamas's exit from the Iranian-Syrian alliance, and emerged as a proxy for NATO and Washington in their efforts to contain Iran. So we're talking about Qatar. In Egypt, Al Jazeera played an instrumental role, popularizing and defending the Muslim Brotherhood's position in the contest between Islamist and secular groups over drafting of a new constitution. Doha also embraced the politically beleaguered presidency of Mohamed Morsi, supplying it with an emergency financial lifeline that amounted to some 7.5 billion in its first year of power. Yet in the aftermath of General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's Saudi-backed coup of July 3rd, 2013, Egypt returned to Doha some 2 billion of the 7.5 billion deposited by Qatar in the central bank. Therefore, relations between Egypt and Doha turned sour, and the latter turned its geopolitical attention to Syria. Okay, so now we go to Turkey. Turkey's role in the region also changed after the uprisings. As Kitty, what are you doing? Okay. Sorry, Kitty, Turkey. The cat is getting into some trouble. Turkey's role in the region also changed after the uprisings, as Recep Tayyip Erdogan became increasingly set on regime change in Syria, turned more authoritarian at home against both the domestic opposition of the Kurds, and his discourse assumed unabashedly sectarian overtones. Ankar's stance vis-a-vis Syria mutated from being a close ally of Bashar's regime, mediating between Damascus and Tel Aviv, shielding Assad from Riyadh's sectarian accusations at its moment of peril immediately after Hariri's assassination, and using Damascus as a bridge to establish its own geopolitical influence in the Arab world. We're talking about Erdogan, to a potential mediator between the Syrian regime, the old Syrian regime, and the opposition in the early stages of the uprising. Then an open critic of the regime's violent crackdown on the uprising, and finally to being Riyadh and Doha's active ally in their determination to topple the regime at any cost. Consequently, Turkey's borders with Syria became awash with all kinds of Salafi jihadis from all over the world seeking to join what was marketed as a war against a minority. I'm sorry, yes, a war against a minority. Shia-aligned regime oppressing the Sunni majority. Turkey's borders with Syria became awash with all kinds of Salafi jihadis from all over the world seeking to join what was marketed as a war against a minority Shia-aligned regime oppressing the Sunni majority. Turkish intelligence played an instrumental role, funneling weapons and material to these groups in a bid not just to topple Bashar's regime, but also to balance against the growing Kurdish autonomy and military assertiveness in Syria's northeast, which is very relevant today, still, obviously. Indeed, as Dexter Filkins argues, ISIS, quote, would never have metastasized as virulently as it has without Turkey's assistance, end quote. Turkey's involvement in Syria and its failure to help. Sorry, I have a very playful cat. You all right? All right. Turkey's involvement in Syria and its failure to topple the regime in Damascus generated much domestic pushback. However, sectarian and ethnic sentiments are on the rise in the country, and a new wave of state-orchestrated violence has led to a military insurgency in the Kurdish regions, and ISIS ultimately turned its suicide attacks against the Kurdish cities. Lulu says it's not accurate. Ba'athist helped bring Tunisians to Syria and to Iraq before. Yeah, when I'm reading a book about anything, especially the Middle East, I don't assume that everything is 100% accurate. It's always going to be through the lens of the author. So, obviously you can take everything with a grain of salt from the perspective it's coming from. This book was written by, who wrote this book? I think so far I found this to be a fairly accurate book, but then again, I am far from an expert in these affairs, which is why I'm reading about it, so that I can learn more. Who wrote this book? Sectarianization, library. Oh, no. Go to title page. Hashemi, Nader Hashemi, and Danny Postel are the authors. Okay. And it was written what year? Let's go to about this book. Published, because when a book is published, it's also pretty relevant. Let's go to page 1. It's annoying. See, this is like why I like a physical book much better. Published in 2017. Okay. Fairly recently. Okay, so let's see. Back to chapter 2. Sectarian and ethnic sentiments are on rise in the country. A new wave of state-orchestrated violence has led to a military insurgency in the Kurdish regions, and ISIS ultimately turned its suicide attacks against the Turkish cities. Moreover, Erdogan's instrumental use of Muslim Brotherhood-affiliated political parties across the Middle East to promote Turkey as the leader of the revived Sunni regional camp clashed with Riyadh's own leadership aspirations. Alternatively, efforts to reach an accommodation with Riyadh after the failure of Erdogan's Syrian policy are bound to alienate Iran as an erstwhile ally Happy New Year, Uncle Coping. Good to see you. I hope you have a great year this year. Let's make it a good one. Okay. Riyadh. Wait, where was I? Doing instrumental. Oh, okay, here. At the time that, hi, good to see you. At the time when Ankara is increasingly dependent on the latter for natural gas imports, given the nosedive Russian-Turkish relations have taken after Turkey shot down a Russian military plane in November 2015. Outmaneuvered by Riyadh on the Sunni front and unable to, this is Erdogan, advance its political agenda in Syria, Turkey responded by intervening in Iraq in December 2015, stationing troops near Mosul in an effort to carve out for itself a sphere of influence in northern Iraq. If anything, Erdogan's policies have taken Turkey from a foreign policy aimed at, quote, zero problems to a geopolitical quagmire. Okay, so that's the author's claim as of 2017. Okay, now Saudi Arabia. More startling, however, is the growing assertiveness of Saudi Arabia's role in the region as it abandoned its tradition of quiet petrodollar diplomacy and proxy geopolitical battles for newfound political bluntness and direct military interventions with dire implications for sectarian sentiments in the region. Saudi Arabia's original stance vis-a-vis the uprisings was shaped by very realist domestic and geopolitical objectives to insulate the kingdom from the democratic winds of the Arab Spring. So they found it a threat to the monarchy, allegedly, protect the survival of monarchical regimes, and undermine Iran's power in the region. It thus used its military forces, financial largesse, and political clout to contain the effects of the uprisings on the Arabian Peninsula, but especially in Bahrain, Yemen, and Oman. Riyadh also extended financial assistance to support the monarchies of Monaco and Jordan, also against mounting domestic calls for reform in a bid to obviate any change among sister monarchical regimes. Saudi Arabia was vocal in its opposition to the Morsi government in Egypt, labeling Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization. Maybe they changed their mind this week. I don't know. People have different opinions. Riyadh played. I'm joking. Don't take me seriously. Okay. Riyadh, take me a little seriously. Riyadh played an instrumental role in orchestrating Sisi's coup and supported the new regime both politically and financially. King Abdullah minced no words praising Sisi's seizure of power and shielded the new regime from both Washington and Doha, declaring August 16, 2013, that, quote, the people and the government of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia stood and still stand today with their brothers in Egypt against terrorism, extremism, and sedition, and against whoever is trying to interfere in Egypt's internal affairs. Alongside the UAE and Kuwait, with whom it shared a deep antipathy towards the Muslim Brotherhood, Saudi Arabia raised $12 billion in emergency funds for the Sisi regime and pledged to compensate Egypt for any loss of American or European aid as a result of the military coup. Sisi's regime spent some $2 billion of aid money from its Gulf allies without much impact on the government balance sheets. Riyadh's open support for the Sisi regime showed how far it was willing to go to contain and reverse the political consequences of popular uprisings. Its indirect support for the anti-Islamist factions vying for power in Libya, namely via Egypt and UAE, exposed to the extent what it considered the Muslim Brotherhood to be a threat to the survival of its own non-participatory and total violence model of governance. So basically the claim is at that time that Saudi Arabia, amongst some other nations, found both the Arab Spring and the Muslim Brotherhood sort of both a threat to their monarchical power. Riyadh's use of sectarianism as an instrument of regional policy became more pronounced after the popular uprisings. It manipulated Sunni Shia divisions and sentiments to shore up support for its regional allies and isolate Iran and its respected Arab allies and proxies. Riyadh justified its military intervention in Bahrain's uprising by characterizing the latter as the work of Iran's Shia agents in the Gulf. Ignoring their genuine demands for socioeconomic and political reforms, it clamped down harshly on opposition in the kingdom's eastern province, labeling demonstrators Iranian Red Shia I can never pronounce this properly. Rawafid, RAWAFIDH agents. Riyadh supported sectarian opposition against Iraq's pro-Iranian al-Maliki government and against the Hezbollah's allied government of Najib Mikati in Lebanon, and accused Tehran of meddling in the kingdom's security backyard by supporting and arming Houthi rebels. Sorry, it's just so funny. In northern Yemen. Okay, but nowhere were Riyadh's sectarian tactics more evident than in Syria, whose alliance with Iran it was determined to end. Okay, moving on. Excuse me, moving on from Saudi. The multi-level struggle for Syria. The overlapping, I'm going to try to rush through this. I really want to get to chapter 3. Okay, but I did want to review this real quick, just as a refresher. Multi-level struggle for Syria, overlapping domestic, regional, and international struggle for Syria is yet another chapter in the grand geopolitical contest underway between Saudi Arabia and Iran and their respective allies. Here again, sectarianism was deployed as a fig leaf for what were actually geopolitical battles. Sectarianism is a tool. It's a political tool. The metamorphosis, it's very easy to match to light, although it is not easy to control what happens after you light the match. So, easy tool to use, but not an easy tool to win with necessarily, depending on what your definition of winning is. Okay, the metamorphosis of the popular uprising in Syria from a peaceful demand for reforms under the existing authoritarian regime to a largely regime-induced civil war with strong sectarian reverberations created a new theater for this geopolitical contest. From a country with a defensive, realist regime preoccupied with nimble footwork of the region's geopolitical battles, Syria was transformed overnight into a battleground for at least 3 overlapping contests. A domestic regime opposition battle that manifested itself in class, regional, and sectarian undertones. A regional confrontation mainly between Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Qatar on one hand, and Tehran and its regional proxies, but especially Hezbollah on the other hand. And finally, an international confrontation between a USA determined to contain and reverse Iran's regional influence and an ascendant, well, that was before Biden gave Iran like a couple $2 billion, and a descendant Russia bent on insulating itself from the threat. Hello. Of radical transnational Islamist groups protecting its Syrian bridgehead in the Arab world, that's Russia, and demonstrating its newfound international reach and stature. This sectarianized geopolitical contest created a political, economic, and societal wasteland in Syria. The sectarianization by both domestic and external actors of vertical cleavages that have long coexisted with other class, ideological, or regional divisions ruptured the country along sectarian, religious, and ethnic lines. Riyadh's near obsession with regime change in Syria is shaped in part by the idiosyncratic syncretic predilections of Saudi decision makers. Just see what Coping has to say. Oh my gosh, go to sleep. Yes, get some rest. Definitely nice to see you. Oh, skip the pages. Okay, they being Saudi, have never forgiven Damascus for Hariri's assassination, nor have they forgotten Bashar's presumptuous words after the 2006 war with Israel, labeling Hezbollah's detractors as half men. Oops. I lost my place. Which was I on? Oh, how frustrating. Hang on a second. Let's see. You click one button on the computer and then it's skipped me to a whole different part of the book. Oh, okay, here, vertical cleavages. Oh, very cool. Okay. Interesting. Here we go. Right. They never forgave Damascus for Hariri's assassination, nor have they forgotten Bashar's presumptuous words after the 2006 war with Israel, right, labeling Hezbollah's detractors as half men. Idiosyncrasies aside, however, Riyadh used the popular uprisings to push for regime change in Syria, was driven primarily by realist geopolitical calculations. It was consequently free road on the democratic aspirations of the Syrian people to undermine Iran's regional influence. Riyadh sought to achieve this by toppling the regime of Iran's principal ally in the Arab world and replace it with one beholden to the kingdom, and furthermore use regime change in Syria to tip the sectarian balance of power in post-Saddam Iraq in Iran's favor. In turn, regime change in Syria would deny Iran access to the territory of an allied state bordering Israel, subsequently curtail its ability to transfer weapons and military supplies to Hezbollah, and deny the latter its Damascus sanctuary used to procure military supplies and transport party cadres and infiltrating Iran. I don't know if you guys could hear that noise, but it is very annoying. Let's close the window. Okay. Oh, that's much better. Oh, so much better. Okay. Transport party. Okay. As not only the producer, but major exporter of the Wahhabi worldview, Saudi Arabia funded and supported local Sunni Salafi rebel groups fighting in Syria to achieve its geopolitical objectives. Thus, on September 29th, 2013, it gathered some 43 rebel brigades into a new fighting force called Jaish al-Islam, which translates, according to this, as the Army of Islam, led by Zahran Aloush, then the Secretary General of the Syrian Islamic Liberation Front. Jaish al-Islam became Riyadh's primary boots on the ground in the battle to topple the regime in Damascus. Similarly, Turkey and Qatar used local Salafi rebel groups to advance their own geopolitical interest in Syria, namely Harakat Ahrar, oh my gosh, Harakat Ahrar al-Sham al-Islamiyah, the Islamic movement of the Freemen of the Levant, That was Turkey and Qatar, which was funded in late 2011 as an umbrella organization for the number of Salafi rebel groups fighting in Syria. Court testimony suggests that the Turkish intelligence service, MIT, helped funnel military supplies to Ahrar al-Sham, held territory in late 2013 and early 2014 under the guise of humanitarian aid. That would not be the first time anybody's done that. This is, unfortunately, probably not the last time. This Islamization of rebel forces, quote, coupled with Riyadh's determination to lead an anti-regime Sunni coalition of regional states consisted of Turkey and Qatar alongside the kingdom, sidelined the most violent local opposition, and contributed to the transformation of Syria's peaceful national uprising into a sectarian military confrontation. I'll just read that again. Sidelined the most violent, sidelined the non-violent local opposition and contributed to the transformation of Syria's peaceful national uprising into a sectarian military confrontation. Okay, that's not the whole story, but it's one part of it. Now, Iran. So that was Syria's contribution along with Qatar and Turkey. Iran, for its part, Tehran had invested substantial political material and symbolic capital in its support of its beleaguered Syrian ally. It shielded the regime politically at the time when the Arab League, led by first Qatar and then Saudi Arabia, orchestrated a diplomatic campaign to ostracize Damascus and lobbied Washington to undertake a military strike aimed at crippling the regime after it was accused of using chemical weapons against rebel forces around Damascus. Who was the American president at that time? Is it Obama? Obama. Tehran managed to keep the Syrian regime financially afloat and supplied it with credit lines to maintain food imports. Underscoring the Iranian commitment to survival of the Syrian regime, General Qassem Soleimani, commander of the Revolutionary Guards, Al-Quds Force, elite Quds Force, assumed personal control of the Iranians' military effort in Syria, coordinating the military activities of scores of Revolutionary Guards and forces, Iranian proxy groups, including Lebanese Hezbollah and Iraqi Shia militias, and a bevy of Shia volunteers from Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, and Afghanistan. Interesting. Tehran's use of sectarian identity and symbols to mobilize proxy Shia non-state actors for the battle in Syria also contributed substantially to the sectarianization of sectarian identities and sentiments in Syria and across the region. The wanton deaths, massive refugee waves, and cause of destruction in Syria epitomize the destructive effects of the sectarianization of regional geopolitical battles and the use of the popular Arab uprisings for otherwise geopolitical ends. As Mark Lynch argues, quote, Syria's war has been the greatest incubator of sectarianism, end quote, in the region. Sunni, Alawi communal massacres and religious and ethnic violence shattered the fabric of society. The sectarian animosities and modes and of mobilizations fill up the vacuum created in the wake of collapsing state institutions. This Saudi-Iranian sectarianization of the geopolitical, quote, struggle for Syria was also instrumental in creating the early sanctuary and breeding grounds for the metamorphosis of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, into the Salafi jihadi killing machine ISIS has become. After all, it was its foray into Syria in defense of Sunni brothers against the, quote, infidel Alawi regime that allowed ISIS to recruit new followers from Syria, Iraq, and beyond, expand territorially, and ultimately create its cross-border caliphate. The manipulation of regional identities by both Saudi Arabia and Iran to protect and advance their geopolitical interests and their similar deployment by their proxies and by Salafi jihadi groups created by ideological and existential preconditions for the emergence and expansion of ISIS. Okay. Now we have Yemen. Let me just skip ahead here and the conclusion. All right, so almost it for this chapter. Okay, Yemen. So that'll be relevant for now. What time is it? Oh, okay. I still have some time. Saudi Arabia's military intervention in Yemen, driven largely by geopolitical considerations, is also securitizing nascent sectarian identities at the expense of far more historically relevant tribal and regional affiliations. That this transpired in a country where, quote, sectarian differences meant almost nothing until recent years, end quote, speaks volumes of the destructive power of sectarianized geopolitical battles. Riyadh insists on perceiving the otherwise multifaceted and complex Yemeni political landscape through a strictly binary sectarian lens. The Houthis' historical, socioeconomical, and political grievances and wars against pro-Saudi pre- and post-uprising governments in Sada are brushed aside. Instead, Riyadh caricatures the Houthis as nothing more than proxy agents of Tehran, possessing no local grievances of their own, created by the latter to undermine the kingdom's southern borders and advance Iran's regional influence. By the way, I don't know if this is 2017, so keep that in mind. Although Iran's support for the Houthis is, to be sure, part of the general pattern described by Gauss, whereby geopolitical adversaries insinuate themselves into domestic struggles of the weak states to build up their own regional influence, it would be wrong to reduce the Houthis to mere proxy agents, divorced of any agency or local grievances rooted in domestic struggles over political power and resources. If anything, both Saudi Arabia and Iran intervene in Yemen to protect or advance their own interests rather than to promote democracy or the well-being of the Yemeni people. Same is true with Iraq, no? The result is a war that has destroyed state institutions and infrastructure, the country's heritage sites, and incurred enormous human losses in civilian population already reeling from decades of government corrupt and neglect. Moreover, the use of sectarianism as an instrument of geopolitics, and the Houthis' vengeful acts as they made their way south from the mountain stronghold devastated the country's shared national traditions and exacerbated sectarian sentiments in the Arabian Peninsula. So, in conclusion of chapter 2, this chapter has contended with the explosion of sectarianism in the Middle East. This chapter has contended that the explosion of sectarianism in the Middle East is not a consequence of immutable or timeless religious differences, but is rather driven by the sectarianization of otherwise realist geopolitical battles and the consequent post-uprising collapse of the state's coercive, institutional, and ideological capacities in a number of countries with plural societies. Be that as it may, once securitized, sectarian identities assume a life of their own, permeating identity politics and public discourse and feeding on states' weaknesses, civil wars, communal fears, and powerful media platforms, with devastating consequences for territorial integrity and national unity of a number of Arab states. The basic argument is here that's being proposed is that a lot of the issues in the Middle East are not ancient problems. Rather, they're essentially sectarianism being used as a tool by various political parties. And then once that tool is activated, it takes a life of its own because you're using people and their identities and their sentiments and their passions and their violence and their peace, etc., to try to shape a region or an outcome in a particular country, usually not your own. So Consequently, and even in states far removed from the region's geopolitical contest, sectarian and ethnic sentiments are on rise in Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, and as far away as Pakistan and Malaysia, courtesy of the influence of new social media. I would argue that it seems like there's a rise of sectarianism in the United States, in Europe, and Britain. Like there's an effort to use sectarianism across the globe now, not just with Middle Eastern politics, but with global politics. And that's sort of a fusion with the identity politics as well, imported from the United States and so on. Okay, where was I? As far away as Pakistan, Malaysia, courtesy of social media, private funding campaigns, satellite channels, and the resurgence of Salafi jihadi preaching. The tsunami unleashed by the sectarianization of regional geopolitical contests has produced centrifugal dynamics that threaten to overhaul existing institutional territorial designs. In Lebanon, where the institutionalization of sectarian identities in the context of a centralized but weak unitary state has always constituted the, I don't know how to pronounce this, the raison d'etre of the political system. Many in the Christian, but mainly Maronite political elite find themselves increasingly marginalized by the Sunni Shia struggle of a post-Syria, Lebanon, watching their political prerogatives erode steadily since the negotiation of the 1989 tariff accord that brought Lebanon's 15-year civil war to an end. They have now raised the banner of broad political, administrative, and fiscal decentralization, a trope for a new confederal power sharing agreement. The idea is to transfer many of the powers of the very centralized Lebanese state to elected and accountable local councils, blah, 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 that would assume control of whether it's a form of territorial or trans-territorial sectarian confederalism, substantial cross-section of Lebanon's Christians born out of the post-war Muslim-dominated centralized state and power sharing arrangement that regulates them to, okay, this makes it sound like they had nothing to do with it. I think they had something to, I think everybody in Lebanon had something to do with what the heck happened and is happening in Lebanon. Just saying. Power sharing regulates them to a mere appendage to the dominant Muslim political and economic elite. Lebanon is no longer the Arab world's outlier state, however. In Iraq, the Kurdish state is all but a practical reality. Its leaders speak openly about the determination to push for secession from Iraq. Once the battle against ISIS is won, not that the Kurds are the only community in Iraq that favors broad regional autonomy. The vocabulary of Taqsim, which means partition according to this book, has entered the lexicon of the South as well, and it's difficult to see how the country's Sunni community will agree to join a national unity government after the battle against ISIS is won without the promise of local autonomy over areas of future Iraq. Decentralized political orders with the broad regional autonomy again along tribal and ethnic lines seem to offer the only hope for future stability in Libya and Yemen as well. Even in the once hyper-centralized Syrian state, there is talk of dissecting the country along new, hitherto unthinkable lines. In the north, Kurdish populated forces are determined to stitch together 3 cantons, Afrin, Kobani, and Jazeera, into contiguous autonomous enclave. The regime in Damascus seems to have acquiesced to this prospect. The old regime would use airstrikes and while U.S. airstrikes inadvertently or not support the Kurdish military efforts, which kind of makes things awkward now for the SDF. Figure all that out. To Turkey's growing chagrin. On the other hand, the strategy of both Assad regime and Iran is to retain control of the swath of territory running along the Adani, Damascus, Homs, Latakia, Ark, euphemistically labeled Syria al-Mufida, useful Syria, one that compromises the country's blah, 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 political, economic, and demographic backbone, and protects Hezbollah's military and training supply routes, hence Tehran's geopolitical interest in the Levant. Russia's military intervention in Syria aims to help the Assad regime consolidate its control over the part of Syria, but also to use it as a launching pad to extend its authority over more territory under the cover of negotiated political sentiment with the non-Slavic jihadist sections of the opposition. The author says goodbye to all that. Okay, so he's as tired of it as I am. Thank God. I think a lot of people are tired of that. He puts out this argument now at the end of the chapter. He says we should not bemoan the end of homogenizing authoritarian centralized state in the crucible of instability stretching from Syria and Iraq to Yemen and Libya, nor are other Arab states with plural societies immune from a similarly destructive fate. Should the same mix of domestic and geopolitical pressures overtake them, that this end has come on the ruins of popular uprisings demanding dignity, social justice, and democratic rights, underscores the destructive powers of the region's authoritarian legacy and sectarianization of its geopolitical struggles, and realist calculations of international actors bent on protecting their strategic interests above all else, which even if it's not nice, I don't know what anybody else can expect. And I think that's a lesson that history teaches time and again. New and genuine power sharing arrangements anchored on inclusive national governments, but substantial decentralization of power to regional authorities while eschewing the reconfiguration of territorial boundaries along explicitly sectarian, tribal, and ethnic boundaries seem to be the only short-run policy option to restore a modicum of stability and preserve the territorial integrity of states torpedoed by domestic upheavals and sectarian geopolitical contests. This does not mean creating sectarian or ethno-federal entities, as some neoconservatives insist, however. As Lebanon and Iraq's post-war experiences suggest, the institutional architecture of any future power-sharing arrangements cannot allow for the marginalization of a sect, confessional, ethnic, or tribal group. It must rather be anchored on the kind of institutions that can help create, in the very long run, intersectarian, ethnic, tribal, and regional alliances that open up possibilities beyond narrow, exclusivist affiliations and modes of political mobilization. They must also empower citizens vis-a-vis accountable officials instead of herding them into sectarian, ethnic, and tribal ghettos and shackles that reify and reproduce what are otherwise modern and, in some but not all cases, recently invented forms of affiliation. After all, truly democratic and decentralized political orders may be the only antidote to death and destruction. I mean, this is his theory. So, visited upon many Arab states since the explosion of popular uprisings, they may even be a necessary first but belated step to the possibility of a future polyphonic reimagining of the polity. What does polyphonic mean? Polyphonic. Producing many sounds simultaneously, many voices. Okay, so he's just talking about a mix of different people. The containment of the sectarian tsunami sweeping across the Middle East. and beyond also entails a new regional grand bargain that reflects the current balance of power. The thing I disagree with him on is I don't think that the solution necessarily to sectarianism is democracy. That's the only thing. Where it's appropriate, sure, but it's not. It's, the opposite of sectarianism is not democracy. I don't think. It's just not sectarianism. It's just not being retarded. Like every region and every groups of people, and I say groups, not group, but groups, because in regions you generally have multiple groups. Some places are homogenous, but most aren't. But you can have different solutions in different places. You really, like, the one size fits all solution, like, doesn't make any sense. And then different kinds of relationships and alliances can be made between different groups, depending on what is appropriate in those areas. It's really not that complicated. The containment of sectarian tsunami, I mean, it is complicated. Sweeping across the Middle East and beyond also entails a new regional bargain that reflects the current balance of power. The geopolitical sea changes occasioned by the 2003 invasion of and occupation of Iraq cannot be wished away. The wall of containment keeping Iran out of the region has broken down, it appears. This is a quote of American acquiescence, as Valley Nasser rightfully contends. Tehran managed successfully to project its influence across an Arab arc stretching from the Mediterranean Sea in the west to the Arabian Sea in the south, a feat that ironically was made possible by misguided neoconservative policies following the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Yep. Riyadh's sectarianization of geopolitical battles to roll back Tehran's penetration of this strategic Arab region has failed, however, and a grand bargain gathering the main regional and international actors led by Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, Russia, and the USA, one that demarcates clear spheres of influence for all involved, could help assuage the kingdom's fears of Iran's newfound regional power. Well, we won't have to worry about that for too long. I'll give another week or two. We'll see. We'll see. Preparations on hand. Its inevitable rapprochement with the USA following the July 14th, 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action or nuclear agreement and its concomitant integration into the global economic system. Only then can a semblance of regional stability be restored, and consequently can the rebuilding of states and societies shattered by sectarianized geopolitical battles commence. A new grand bargain, so I'm just reading this again. Gathering the main regional international actors led by Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, Russia, and the USA, one that demarcates clear spheres of influence for all involved. It could help us with, yeah, see, that's not happening. That's not where we are today. But it's nice of the offer to lay out an idea. We'll see what happens. Okay. So that was chapter 2. Yeah, that was chapter 2. Chapter 3 is the Arab region at tipping point, why sectarianism fails to explain the turmoil. Let's see. And do I have time and energy to read it? Is the question. Let me see what time it is. Oh, I don't have time. I do not have time. Okay. All right. So I'm going to stop here. And I will get back to chapter 3 hopefully fairly shortly, actually. If I can this week, we'll see. And if I can't, possibly in 2 months from now. So Happy New Year's, everyone. And have a wonderful day, evening, life, wherever you are. Right. End stream. End stream.